A couple of months ago, I made a video about nationalities in fighting games. Nearly every fighting game that takes place in the real world will list a nationality for each character, and I find it interesting how they decide this and how it forms the character. I guess you can watch this video first, but if you haven't seen the original, I recommend going and doing that before you watch this video, because I'll reference it a lot. Street Fighter, Tekken, and Mortal Kombat are not the only fighting games that do this though, so in this video I'll go through 3 new fighting game series and the nationalities of each character in them and how it affects the game. The 3 games in this list were chosen because I think they take an approach to assigning nationalities that's different from how other games do it. 2 of them are even in completely different time periods from now. Only other thing I want to add is that this won't be literally every character. I try to get as many as possible, but it won't be literally all of them. That's about it, so let's get into the first series, The King of Fighters. In case you didn't know, The King of Fighters is a crossover series. Most of the iconic characters are newcomers, but the game started as a crossover between Fatal Fury, Art of Fighting, Psycho Soldier, and Ikari Warriors, all series made by SNK. 2 of those are fighting games, and they also assign characters nationalities. So just for future reference, I'm only going to be talking about the characters who have actually made an appearance in the King of Fighters series. In the original KOF game, the King of Fighters 94, we have 8 teams, and they all have 3 members. Each team represents 1 country. And there are 3 characters per team. Those characters don't always necessarily have to be from the country though. Team Hero is from Japan, Team Fatal Fury representing Italy, Mexico for Team Art of Fighting, the UK for Team Women Fighters, Brazil for Team Ikari Warriors, Team Korea Justice from South Korea, China for Team Psycho Soldier, and finally the American sports team from the US. Only about half of those teams actually have 1 character from that country though. Those are Team Hero, Korea Justice, Psycho Soldier, and American Sports. And this country theme would be dropped in the next entry. Sorry if that was overly complicated for something that is literally no bearing on characters' nationalities. Anyways, as is the nation SNK is from, Japan has a lot of characters. Kyobe is the first protagonist introduced in KOF, and he's your typical high school guy except with flame powers. His main martial arts are an ancient form of karate of the Kusanagi clan, as well as Chinese boxing mixed in. Having non-Chinese characters use Chinese forms of martial arts is what a lot of fighting games will do occasionally, and it makes sense because, it's such a big part of the history of martial arts, you know. Anyways, Joe from the Fatal Fury series is from Japan. He's a champion of Muay Thai. Oftentimes, practitioners of the art in fighting games will actually be from Thailand, but not him this time. And it makes sense because it's, again, such a big part of martial arts history. Also from Fatal Fury is Mai. She's like the fan service character and ninja. The protagonist of Psycho Soldier, Athena Asamiya, is also Japanese. She's a high schooler, but this time a pop star. The protagonist of Art of Fighting, Ryo, comes from Japan. He's a master of a fictional karate style called Kyokugenryu, along with his father Takuma and younger sister Yuri. Martial arts is a huge part of the Art of Fighting series. Main protagonists all practice and live at the same dojo until whatever conflict happens in them. One of their enemies is Aiji, who shows up in KOF 95, and he's a ninja who is obsessed with, just killing them or something. One of his teammates is Iori Yagami, the main rival to Kyo. He is vicious, bloodthirsty, and he even has flame powers like Kyo. His fighting style is a traditional martial art of the Yagami clan, and he's so much of a hater that even when his whole reason for hating Kyo is revealed to be a lie, and they voluntarily join the same team, he still hates him a lot. By the way, whenever they do have to work together, because ancient treasure and stuff, Chizuru Kagura often acts like the glue to keep them from killing each other. That's a misnomer. Iori from killing Kyo. Kyo, Iori, and Chizuru are all parts of separate ancient Japanese clans. This heritage ends up being important to the series, as it falls to them to do as their ancestors did and seal away Orochi, an ancient god. Orochi has followers all over the world called the Hekeshu. Sometimes they act as antagonists. A few of them have their nationalities listed as unknown, which makes sense, they are very mysterious people, But Ryuji Yamazaki from Fatal Fury series and Yashiro from the King of Fighters 97 are both Japanese and members of the Hakeshu. Can I just say, that's a thing I like about KOF. Ryuji Yamazaki was a villain from Fatal Fury, and it was the decision of KOF to make him one of the Hakeshu. He doesn't actually actively follow Orochi, and no joke, his sheer insanity prevents him from being controlled by Orochi, but this at least adds some depth and layers to a character where it wasn't necessarily present for, and I find that cool. Also, there's Shingo. He's a high schooler obsessed with Kyo, and similarly to him, uses Chinese boxing and Kusanagi martial arts. And finally, I guess I need to talk about these guys. Haomaru and Nakaru from Samurai Showdown. I think I might need to save them for a potential future video though. If I ever do make a Nationalities for Fighting Games Part 3, I'll talk all about Samurai Showdown, I promise. Sam Show does do some interesting things with its nationalities, and despite being called Samurai Showdown, they're not all actually from Japan. That's the last Blade's job. The United States also has had a lot of representation in the series ever since the first game. Terry and his brother Andy are both the main protagonists of the Fatal Fury series. They're usually on the same side as Joe from before. Andy's your stoic type, while Terry is the most unabashedly American possible. I'm sure you know this guy from Smash. He can canonically make 53 throws in a row because of course he can. They both use Hakyo-Siken, an ancient Chinese martial art which was taught to them by an old man named Tung Fu Rei, who also ends up becoming pretty important later on. The American sports team are also from the US. They are and will probably always be just fodder, but I think that's okay. Team Akari Warriors have a home stage in Brazil, but are all Americans. Ruff, Clark, and Hyder. They, of course, make use of the second most American thing besides sports, guns. The three of them are soldiers as well, being pretty heavy grapplers who can do some scary things. Fatal Fury has lots of other iconic characters from America. Its main setting is a place called Southtown in the United States, so it makes sense. Terry's girlfriend Mary is from America. She's a secret agent who uses the martial art of Sambo. Sambo is like the most Soviet martial art ever, but it can still make sense for an American secret agent. The series' main villain is Geese Howard. He can use the same Hakyo-Seken martial arts as the main protagonist. And he has a son named Rock Howard, who's adopted by Terry, and uses a combination of Geese and Terry's moves. And then there's Duck King, a rap star who fights with breakdancing. I feel like when you think of dance fighting game characters, you imagine something like Eddie Gordo, who uses capoeira, the actual dancing martial art, but Duck King is just breakdancing and meant to replicate American rap culture more than anything. Obviously not that accurately. This was a fighting game made in like 1991, but at least they tried with video game's sixth best DK. So, by the way, in case you haven't noticed, Team Fatal Fury is made up of Terry, Andy, and Joe, and they were the characters representing Italy. None of them actually come from Italy, though. One character who does is Robert Garcia, the best friend of Ryo from Art of Fighting. So naturally, he is also a practitioner of Kyokugen Ryu. And then, I might as well get China out of the way now. Yet China is easily the country in here with the most representation in the series. Again, due to the huge history of martial arts and fighting in the country. So let's get to it. Team China is made up of Athena, the Japanese high school girl from earlier, as well as her master Chin Gensai. He's from China and uses the drunken fist martial arts style, so he represents that archetype. There's also Si Kensu and Bao, who both use kung fu as well as psychic powers. Tung Fu Rei, the master of Terry and Andy, would go on to be playable in The King of Fighters 11, and so would a schoolgirl named Li Zhangfei, like the Zhao Yu of this series. And then we get a bunch of cool assassins with Shen Wu and Lin. I mean, just look at them. They use your typical kung fu as well, but with a deadlier twist. In The King of Fighters 14, we're then introduced to Shunei, new protagonist of this series. He and Mai Kun, his best friend, are both from China, and they're disciples of Tung Fu Rei, meaning they also use Hakyo-Seken. Shunei and Kyo are the only main King of Fighters protagonists we actually know their nationality, since K-Dash is a clone and clones can't exactly have nationalities, and Ash Crimson is Ash Crimson. But I digress. There's also Mian, who adapts traditional Chinese opera and fights with things such as folding fans. Next up, Team Art of Fighting was headquartered in Mexico, but didn't actually have any characters from Mexico. The country would later on get some representation though. In case you didn't know, SNK and the King of Fighters series is huge in Latin America. To many people, this is like the first thing they know about the country. For Mexico specifically, there's Ramon and King of Dinosaurs. They're both luchadors, meaning they're pretty heavy grapplers. And Angel, she's a wrestler too, but incorporates elements of, you guessed it, Muay Thai. The three Mexican fighters even make a team together in King of Fighters 14 with Team Mexican Wrestling. South America has a lot of representation in this series too, although that doesn't really happen until KOF 14, where Team South America was made. There's Nelson, who's a boxer, and Bandeiras Hattori, who uses Brazilian ninjutsu. They both come from Brazil, and like other fighting games, the majority of South American representation is from Brazil. I think those are pretty neat additions, since oftentimes fighting games won't really let characters from countries like Brazil use martial arts not originating from or around their country. So making a Brazilian boxer and a ninja is pretty unique. Zarina is from Colombia, which as far as I know is a unique country. I haven't seen any other fighting games which have a character from Colombia. The King of Fighters 15 would then give us Isla, who comes from Chile, which I'm sure is also unique to them. So yeah, like I said before, and we'll probably say again, adding characters from different and new countries is a cool thing. Now look, I have a confession to make. Two of my favorite characters in this series come from Britain and France. Yes, I know. How could I like British and French people? But they're cool, I promise. Billy Kane from England is Terry's rival, and a villain from Fatal Fury. He takes inspiration from the 80s and 90s punk scene London was known for, except he really hates smoking for some reason. He fights with the pole, which is a style known as bojutsu. I really like this fighting style in fighting games. Is this because I can easily cheese fights with it? Maybe, but nevertheless, he is still really cool. It's not the UK, but there are two Irish characters as well. Oswald, an assassin who takes inspiration from the stereotypical image of a butler and fights with cards, and Chrysalid. He's an agent of an evil secret society called Nests. He's a clone of K-Dash, who is a clone of Kyo. Generally for clones, their nationalities are listed as unknown, but he's an exception. Probably because Nest has a base in the Isle of Man in the UK, which is like between Ireland and Great Britain. And I'm stealing this joke from Thorgy's Arcade, but the Isle of Man does sound like the name of an island that an evil secret race would be on. Anyways, France actually has a huge amount of representation in this series, starting with King from the first game. She's the cool character from France I mentioned earlier, definitely one of my favorites. She started as a villain in Art of Fighting, but later we find out she only did what she did for money and becomes a mainstay member of the Kyokugenryu Dojo crew, and she even joins Team Art of Fighting in KOF 15. Even though she's from France, her main way of fighting is, you guessed it, Muay Thai, and this often makes her sort of like a rival to Joe, who also uses Muay Thai. All their dynamic really ends up being, though, is he says, you use Muay Thai bad, that's a ripoff of mine, and she says, no it isn't, and they fight. King isn't the only French character who is really fucking hot, because we also have Shuri, one of the Hekeshu, and the greatest Stacy in all of fighting games. One of the main rivals of this series is French, and that is Elizabeth Blantorche. She is a French noblewoman, extremely stuck up and rich. She enjoys wine and horseback riding. The person she's a rival to is Ash Crimson, the protagonist of the Tales of Ash saga. His nationality is unknown, although he was raised in France, so the country has a pretty big role in that saga story mode. And finally, Sylvie Paula Paula, a pop idol with a mysterious past, is also here, and also managed to be cool despite committing the grave sin of being French. Finally, the last of the countries from the original KOF 94 is South Korea, the home country of Kim Ka-Fwan. Originally from Fatal Fury, he's here using the power of fighting to try and reform two criminals, named Chang and Choi, acting as their mentor and teaching them Taekwondo. Kim proudly displays the South Korean flag on his gi, and I imagine it would make me feel very patriotic if I was South Korean. Chang and Choi are both Korean as well, and later on, all the new Korean characters are related to him somehow. His rival Jun-hoon, non-criminal apprentice Mei Lee Jinju, who's somehow more obsessed with justice than him, and his master Gae-il. Yeah, this series has a lot of love for Korea and Taekwondo. The rest of the KOF series gives us some more countries. Chris is one of the Hikeshu, and he's from Sweden. Like I said before, Sweden is generally the Scandinavian country fighting game characters will come from, if they're not Vikings. Through villains, we get representation of Australia and Germany. For Australia, there's Mr. Big, the antagonist of the first Art of Fighting game. He fights with a Filipino martial art called Eskrima, which involves fighting with sticks, and there's Raiden, a pro wrestler. If you are an Aussie in fighting games, odds are you will be a villain. Just ask Kano from Mortal Kombat. Germany has a lot of villains too. Unlike with Australia, it's a bit more obvious where that stereotype originates from, but in KOF it's not just villains. There are a lot of German villains. Wolfgang Krauser and Hein are German, and Rugel Bernstein is, probably German. His name is Rugel Bernstein, but there are two main protagonists as well, Alba and Soiree Mera, the two brothers who are protagonists of the KOF Maximum Impact series. Normally, I don't mention spin-off characters here, but I kind of have to just because they're main protagonists, and I think it's worth mentioning. I couldn't really find a reason they're from Germany specifically, but I think it's nice to get main protagonists that aren't from the big three of Japan, China, or the USA. The King of Fighters 99 gives us Maxima, who is the most important person for me to talk about in this video because he is the one character from Canada. And yeah, he's a pretty cool representation of it. Certainly better than Street Fighters, but I find it odd how literally every Canadian fighting game character I've found has been a grappler. Odd, not bad, just odd that it's such a reoccurring pattern. And yeah, they definitely modeled this guy's face on Wolverine, by the way. In KOF 13, we would get Hua Jai, finally giving us the iconic Muay Thai bad guy, and he is actually from Thailand. He is like the other villains of this category I talked about in previous videos, Street Fighter Sagat and Tekken 7 Fakumram, because it turns out that he's not that big of a bad guy, eventually being redeemed, and showing a mutual love of the martial art with Joe. Joe can't seem to do the same with some other people though. Moving forward, Russia gets some representation with the wrestler Antonov. Saudi Arabia gets some in the Vigilante Najd, being the first Arabian in the series, and Kukri, who is the first African in the series. The specific country he's from is unknown, although it's likely Mali, because that's where his adopted mother Dolores is from. I've probably said this at least 20 times now, but while I couldn't really find a reason Mali specifically is where she comes from, it's still cool to see lesser known countries being represented here. And even though it's taken a while, it's cool to see someone from Africa coming to KOF. As far as I know, Mali is a unique country, because I couldn't find any other fighting game series with a Malian, so yay for KOF. That's it for Nationalities of the King of Fighters series. I feel like it doesn't have as high a number of different countries as something like Tekken. Spain or India, for example, both usually get representation pretty early in a fighting game series, but KOF has none. And something like Russia, well, it's usually pretty early on in other series, it doesn't have any here.
Until pretty later on.
But that's mostly because KOF's representation is more concentrated. I think a lot of Latin American and Japanese characters is a big part of their fan base, and having a lot of characters using martial arts, not necessarily from their countries of origin, such as Mr. Big or Blue Mary. Interesting approach to take for the concept of fighting game nationalities. Moving forward, we're going with a series that is a little different from the previous games I've talked about here. Why? Well, it takes place in the 22nd century. I'm talking about Guilty Gear. Now, the world in Guilty Gear does look a little bit different from our own. For example, every single fucking country in Europe, except for the ones you want to be destroyed, UK and France, have been completely destroyed. And Japan has been literally destroyed. Not just as a state, the territory just isn't there anymore. The USA and China still exist as nations, and most of Europe and Africa are governed by an organization called the United Kingdoms of Illyria, with a capital in Rome. However, characters' nationalities are still listed, even though they might come from non-existent states. So basically, we can proceed as normal. Also keep in mind that characters don't really use martial arts. This is more of a sword/weapon-based fighting game. So, with that said, let's talk about all the Americans in this series. The protagonist of the series is named Soul Bad Guy, and he comes from the United States. It's unknown where specifically, although his home stage is a recreation of New York City titled Neo New York. Who the hell let them get away with titling it that? This is worse than the Angel's Angel situation. You know what else has a location titled Neo New York? Barkley showed up in Jam Gaiden. Anyways, he's brash and rude and obviously cool, and is now a bounty hunter. He was formerly a member of something called the Sacred Order of Holy Knights. More on them later. Another is the ninja Chip Danoff. He is a ninja as well as a reformed drug dealer. Insert some kind of joke about Americans drug trafficking or something. I can't think of any. Anyways, he's a huge weeb since his master was Japanese, despite that country non-existing. And there's Johnny, a womanizing sky pirate, whose rough exterior hides a genuine care for the weak. And of course, we need our unabashed American, Gold Lewis Dickinson. I mean, just look at him. He's the Secretary of Defense of the USA, and he's actually a pretty chill guy, though. He fights with the coffin directly from Area 51, that presumably has an alien in it. Raises a few questions, but still cool. The dude who destroyed Japan is American, too. Her name is Justice, and she's basically a super weapon. An American weapon destroying Japan. Wonder what that could be a metaphor for. While Japan is gone, punishment for making anime no doubt, there are still plenty of survivors from the attack. One of the most famous Japanese characters in the series is Baiken, a wandering samurai weighed down by her very large and heavy locks of hair, and, trauma from parents dying or something. She is dedicated to revenge on the man who indirectly caused Japan to be destroyed. She isn't just a female version of the stereotypical wandering samurai, though. She has a lot of dedication to her own culture and people, and cares a lot about the remaining colonies. She was featured as a guest character in the game Samurai Showdown, meaning all three series I talk about here have a connection to that series. If you are familiar with fighting games, you can probably guess what the third game I'll be talking about in this video is, if you couldn't before. There's also Anji Mito. He fights with traditional Japanese dances and fans, meaning Guilty Gear does a neat thing where a woman is in a traditionally masculine role and a man is in a traditionally feminine role. Then we have a couple characters from China. Dr. Baldhead, a formerly normal doctor who went insane and became a serial killer, and Jam Kuritoberry, one of the only characters in this series who doesn't fight with a weapon, since she's able to use the power of ki. And one of the main characters in the series is Kai Kisuke. He is Soul Bad Guy's rival, and he comes from France. He's a very experienced fighter. At one point, he led the Sacred Order of Holy Knights, an elite military order dedicated to protecting humanity. And later he became one of the kings of the United Kingdoms of Illyria. He's also a family man with a son named Sin Kesuke. His rival Soul Bad Guy is also technically his father-in-law, despite being about the same age, and he's married to someone who is like an android, so technically 3 years old. Don't think about it too hard. Guilty Gear has a lot of pretty cool characters from the UK, including someone who is like Billy Kane, and then he takes inspiration from the punk rock scene London was known for. Only he's probably the most unsubtle reference to a real person in fighting games. You thought Bruce Lee clones were banned? His name is Axl Lowe. Literally just Axl Rose, but said with a Japanese accent. In a Japanese video game. There's also Venom, an assassin, probably the most reoccurring occupation in fighting games. He fights with billiards-based moves. Generally a pretty cool playstyle. His master Zato 1 is Spanish, although it doesn't really have too much bearing on his personality. And then there's Bridget. In Guilty Gear X2, she was a male who was more feminine presenting, and after appearing in a bunch of spin-offs, she comes back in Guilty Gear Strive, now as a trans woman. She's from a wealthy noble family in England, and she also has the oh-so-common profession of bounty hunter. Yeah, you see her, she's a bounty hunter, and a pretty vicious one. I suppose since I did this last time, I should also talk about the Irish character now, Happy Chaos. He is some kind of non-human creature due to receiving complete knowledge of everything in the universe, but before that he was Irish. We barely know anything from when he was a human though. Moving forward, a couple characters are from Switzerland, not usually in fighting games, but it's a fairly well-known country, so it is in some. There's Cliff Anderson, a very strong member of the Sacred Order of Holy Knights. who is now retired due to being super old, and his adopted child, Testament. Testament was originally the mid-boss of the first Guilty Gear, as they were mind-controlled by the evil Justice, but was able to break free after Justice died. They now want to see all the beautiful things humanity has created, and it's pretty wholesome. From Russia is Milia Rage, an assassin, that again, who absolutely rocks that one Russian hat whose name I don't know and won't look up. And there's a character from Australia named Zappa, an ordinary guy who just happens to be possessed by spirits. Two characters come from Germany, Raven, an immortal soldier born in medieval times, so technically in the Holy Roman Empire, and now serves the series' main villain, Batman. And there's Leo Whitefang. He's one of the other kings of Illyria, alongside Kai Kiske, and fights with twin blades. There's South Korea and Romania with Koo Hae-hun, a teenage girl who fights with a mech suit in the shape of an old man, and like Jam uses Ki, and Slayer. He's from Romania, so guess what he is? That's right, a vampire. More specifically, a Nightwalker, which is similar to a vampire, but without their weaknesses. Probably so we can fight on every stage. He fits the archetype of a vampire, being very dignified yet absolutely bloodthirsty, literally, although he definitely plays up the elegance part a lot more. There is one other character who is a vampire, named Nagoriyuki, and he's from Nigeria. From what I could find, and I could be wrong on this, there isn't really a vampire equivalent from any regions close to Nigeria, but there are still vampires from all over the world, so it is cool to see one not just from Europe. He fights with a blood-sucking katana and a mask clearly inspired by Hanya masks from Japanese theater. The last country represented by Guilty Gear is Brazil with Giovanna. She's Brazilian, but it doesn't really come up with her since she's an agent of the US government. I mean, the government of Brazil is presumably gone now, so it does make sense she'd want to side with someone else, Overall, Guilty Gear is a little strange when it comes to nationalities, simply because in-universe the concept of a nation is different than it is here. Characters still have nationalities though. In a few cases it doesn't really come up, such as Giovanna, Happy Chaos, or Zato 1, which is perfectly fine. You don't need to have a reason for a character to come from a country. There doesn't need to be an in-universe explanation for why this dude is Irish specifically. He just is. However, I do wish Guilty Gear had done more world building through these nationalities sometimes. Something like Japan being destroyed and colonies being built for the survivors adds some neat depth to the world, so they could have done a similar thing to explain what happened to Brazil or West Africa in this post-apocalyptic world through Giovanna Nagoriyuki. It isn't too big a deal, just something I think was a missed opportunity. That said, we're going to move on to the third series I'll be talking about in this video, Soul Calibur. Unique in that it takes place in the past, more specifically in the late 16th century, and some of the characters' choices are impacted by that. Now, it is important to note, since this is old, a lot of countries are different then than they are now. What I'm going to do is give each person a country based on what the countries are now known as, and explain where specifically they're from. Similarly to Guilty Gear, this is also a more weapon-based fighting game rather than martial arts, so that might impact some things too. The majority of characters in the series come from Europe, which makes sense, but there are a lot of characters from Asia, namely Japan, Korea, and China. Japan is where the character Mitsurugi hails from, who's the main character of this series. Mitsurugi is basically just a samurai. His main motivation is to seek out strong warriors and good battles like a typical samurai, and we have the ninja and Taki. Later on we're introduced to Maxi. Now, Maxi technically comes from the Ryukyu Kingdom, like those islands underneath Japan. It is now a part of Japan, but wasn't when Soul Calibur takes place, even if it is quite similar culturally. He fights with nunchucks and is a pirate who also happens to be obsessed with his own looks. There's Shura, a woman possessed by a demon who dual-wields sick katanas, and finally Natsu. She's Taki's apprentice and a young girl. She also has a demon inside of her, though it doesn't make her quite as bloodthirsty as Shura. Japan is actually not the most represented country in this series, because that honor goes to China, who has exactly one more character. Well, unless you count guest characters, because if you do, yeah, it's Japan. Thanks Haomaru and Heihachi. So let's just give this prestigious award to Japan yet again. Anyways, the first game, Soul Edge, gives us Li Long. He fights with nunchucks like Moxie, only he was hired by the Chinese emperor to stop pirates. Soul Calibur would give us Keelik, a warrior who fights with the staff. You know how much I like that playstyle. And Zhanghua. She fights with the Chinese type of sword called the Zhang. Keelik and Zhanghua have an on-again relationship, and in Soul Calibur 5, after a time jump, we are introduced to their son Shiba, who's like Keelik but with a little bit more Sun Wukong put in there. In fact, he was raised by Zhanghua's father, whose name literally is Kong. There's Alexia, who is a daughter of Zhanghua with another man, and Jipa is estranged from Zhanghua because a functioning family in a fighting game? No way. Moving towards Europe, there's Cervantes, the main villain of Soul Edge. He's a cursed pirate who decided to forsake his home country of Spain and became a pirate, since his father was a privateer who sailed for the Spanish government, but was killed by an English warship. The Soul Calibur series has many characters from Greece as well, although technically at the time it was all part of the Ottoman Empire. In the first game, there's Sophitia, the daughter of a baker from Athens who worships the old Greek gods, even if the 16th century is a little bit late to do so. Well, a few Greek gods do canonically exist, so the whole pantheon probably does too. Sophitia is probably one of the most recognizable characters in this series, and the Greek mythology theme of her is instantly recognizable just by looking at her design. She has a sister named Cassandra as well, and in Soul Calibur 5 she isn't playable, but her son Patroclus is, and is the main character of that game. Patroclus is different to Sophitia and Cassandra, given he's a lot more arrogant and brash, but aspires to be a holy warrior just like them. He also has a sister named Pyra, who wields the same iconic Omega Sword and Elk Shield Sophitia used to. There's also another Greek character, and that is Aeon Kalkos. He is a lizard man, and while Sophitia and her family comes from Athens, Aeon is Spartan. I'm no history expert, but I'm quite sure the 1500s didn't exactly have the same Athens versus Spartan dynamic anymore, but it is still a neat touch to have both Athenians and Spartans. This dude Astaroth is also related to Greek mythology. He's a golem brought back to life by Ares to get the Soul Edge, but he actually comes from Persia, or Iran as it is now called. It makes sense that he doesn't necessarily come from Greece. Persia was part of the Greek Empire at one point after all, but it definitely kind of contributes to the unfortunate narrative that Greek Empire was full of noble people and Persia was full of degenerate brutes, found in a lot of media. But that's a way bigger discussion from this video, and it doesn't help that the other Persian character is generic assassin. Anyways, let's move to the United Kingdom. Of course, it wasn't united at the time, and all the characters who come from it are native to England. Introduced in the first Soul Calibur is Rock. He was born in London, but while he was at sea, his ship was attacked by Cervantes, and he somehow managed to survive and go to an undisclosed part of the New World. And he lived there with an orphan Apache boy named Bangu. I definitely wonder where in the New World he got this rhinoceros mask though. And I am pretty surprised there are no playable Soul Calibur characters who were born in the New World. I think it might be cool to see a surviving Aztec warrior or a Native American character, both archetypes the similar Samurai Shodown series technically has. I guess there's Spawn from the far-off land of Detroit though. This was very close to becoming the only game I talk about here without a character from the United States. But I digress. There's also Ivy, the daughter of Cervantes, who's British despite her Spanish father, and was raised by the wealthy Valentine family in London. Now, what gets just a little bit complicated when you're talking about nationalities in this series is the country of Italy. Italy was not unified, you see, so it was all just a bunch of different kingdoms. And the three Italian characters are all from different kingdoms now part of Italy. There's Voldo from Palermo, Sicily, which was at the time part of the Kingdom of Naples. He has nightmare fuel generated by nightmare nuclear fission, and I would like to stop talking about him now. There's also Valeria, who is one of the three shopkeepers in Soul Calibur 3. She is from Venice, which was its own country at the time, called the Venetian Republic, and she somehow has larger breasts than Taki. I also kind of forgot about Hualin, who is a shopkeeper from China. Oops. And there's still the third shopkeeper I'll talk about later, by the way. The third Italian is the guest character from Assassin's Creed 2, Ezio Auditore della Firenze, who is della Firenze, aka Florence. I know it's small, but I do appreciate how the Soul Calibur games don't actually just say Italy as characters' nationalities. They do commit to historical accuracy and form nationalities around it. It's just fun to see. Anyways, while Italy has a bit of a complicated situation, there's a slightly more complicated situation in Germany. Just like Italy, the concept of Germany as a nation didn't really exist at the time. It was all loosely unified under the Holy Roman Empire, so just keep that in mind, I guess. The most well known is Siegfried. He's like a more optimistic version of Guts from Berserk, and as the series goes on, he goes from a 16-year-old kid to a fully fledged knight. Although his sword isn't quite as big as Guts, and he doesn't have the flame powers, so there's still room for Guts as a guest character in Soul Calibur 7. Soul Calibur 4 gives us Hilde, the princess of a fictional kingdom called Wolfkrone, located in the HRE. She becomes a mercenary under Siegfried, and fights with the short sword spear combo, which doesn't seem all that practical, but is cool, I guess. In Soul Calibur 6, the main villain as well is from Germany. Well, I suppose his location is only listed as Holy Roman Empire, so it's possible he's from a country besides Germany, but whatever. Hoo boy, another complicated one. But this time it's not because the country is unified and wasn't always, it's because the country used to be unified and isn't anymore. That's Korea. Well, it's actually not complicated. The specific locations of all characters are from South Korea anyways, so they're South Korean. There were two South Korean characters who debuted in Soul Edge, Sungmina and Hwang. Hwang fights with a Chinese longsword and is the best in his dojang, where he became friends with the master's daughter, Sungmina. Rather than fighting with the sword, she uses a type of pole called the naginata from Japan. Later on, Hung Sung-young is introduced. He's essentially a rival to Hwang and replaces him, sort of. The character of Raphael comes from France. He uses a rapier and fencing techniques, which fits the image of France a lot. He's a nobleman and is very overly arrogant and boastful, sort of like Elizabeth from before. He has an adopted daughter named Amy, who behaves similar to him and also fights with a rapier. Moving on, I must confess, I lied in my last video. Yeah, I'm sorry, look, when talking about Josie Rizal in Tekken, I said that the Philippines was a unique country and I could not find any other character from there. Well, there's Talim. Talim is a young girl who is a priestess of a wind god, so she's able to fight with the power of wind in her attacks. She fights with two blades, which is essentially eskrima, something now known as the martial art of the Philippines. The reason I didn't know she was from the Philippines before is because I went on Wikipedia and it listed her as Spain because it was part of Spain at the time, although it didn't really say Philippines specifically. This is why you do research on the Soul Calibur wiki instead of Wikipedia. So that said, let's move on to the actual unique country in Soul Calibur, Ukraine. This is where the character of Lynette comes from. You're probably a bit surprised that it's Ukraine and not something like Russia, and while Russia did exist back then, it wasn't quite as powerful as it is now. But what was pretty powerful was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Kyiv, where Lynette comes from, was part of that at the time, which is obviously part of Ukraine now. Okay, so you know how I said Scandinavian characters are often from Sweden if they're not Vikings? Well, the last Soul Calibur character is Gro, and I don't think he actually is a Viking, but he is a warrior, and he does come from Norway, so let's just consider him that for now. Now, technically, this was Denmark-Norway at the time. Those two countries were unified, but his location was specified as Norway. So that is it for Soul Calibur. And what I think we can take away from it is that doing just a little bit of research on countries in this context can really pay off sometimes and add some depth to the world. Making era-accurate nationalities for each character wasn't necessarily something they had to do, but they did it anyways. I think it shows care and genuine attention to detail for each character. What we can take away from this video is that, well, most of the time it doesn't mean anything. Sometimes giving characters nationalities in fighting games can add depth if you're not pigeonholing them into stereotypes. Fighting games are often worldwide tournaments and enjoyed by people worldwide. So to see where everyone comes from and how it factors into their journey, it's just neat. And I think it's cool that I'm not the only one who thinks so. Thanks for watching, and I will see you later.